Since the 2008 financial crisis nearly bankrupted this sparsely populated island, it's become hooked on tourism. However, travel restrictions because of COVID-19 show just how much the country relied on tourists for growth. Challenging is it to be a leader during these times?
It's very challenging, and I don't think any leader of any nation actually wishes for that to wake up one morning and actually realize that we're faced with a pandemic. And I don't think that any of us really foresaw what a drastic effect COVID would have on our lives and on our societies. And I think actually it's been a difficult time, a challenging time, but we have also learned a lot of lessons. And because you mentioned climate change, I think we can actually take some of the lessons we've learned from COVID and really use those lessons to deal with the climate crisis. For example, to have that close cooperation between politicians and scientists, to take very seriously what the scientists are saying, but also to have that international cooperation, which actually has proven to be very important in the times of a pandemic.
It's interesting. I know you've been asked this question a number of times, but I'll ask it again. Women leaders during the pandemic. You look at New Zealand, you look at Germany, you look here, and somehow women leaders have really excelled during this period of time in dealing with the pandemic. Why do you think that is?
It's always difficult to generalize, but I think the leaders that have maybe been performing best during COVID has been the leaders that have been humble enough to realize that you really don't have all the answers. And I think that's part of really being able to cooperate with the scientists, the academics, the professionals, is to say, okay, the politicians don't really have all the answers. Obviously, we have our values and our vision, and that guides us through the pandemic. But we also need to be ready to say, okay, so the plan we made on day 1, maybe it's not working, so we need to make a new plan on day 15 or day 30. So I think that was one of the things that at least I learned from COVID personally, that it's very important to be flexible and to realize that you don't have all the answers in the beginning, and you need to be ready to embrace that fact.
As far as climate, you wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times in August of 2019, and the words really jump right off the page. The ice is leaving.
Yeah.
And it was such a heartfelt, personal story about how our actions in the United States, everywhere around the world, are impacting you and your country. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, maybe it's part of that. Living in Iceland, we are in a very close, the nature is really everywhere. I just live here in Reykjavik, the capital, but I only have to walk a few steps and then I'm looking at the sea. The glaciers are also part of our nearest surroundings. So you could say that we're very conscious about the consequences of climate change on our neighborhood, if I could say so, which is really the whole ecology of Iceland. And for us, the glaciers are a very important part of not just the landscape and our environment, but they are also the source of our renewable energies, because we actually use the glacial rivers that come from the glaciers to make electricity. So what we're seeing happening, we're seeing the glaciers retreating, they are slowly moving back, getting smaller every year, and this op-ed you mentioned was because one of the glaciers actually had disappeared. So we're actually seeing climate change happen under our very noses.
How frightening is that? I mean, to see a glacier disappear.
Well, I think it really shows us that this isn't just words, on a paper. It's not just a report, one of those reports that is read and then just put in the shelf. It's really happening. It's going to have a huge effect on all our lives. And the glaciers are just one part of that. We also And when you meet Icelandic fishermen, they actually see the change that's happening in the marine waters, which are actually caused by climate change.
Katrin is Iceland's second female prime minister and has been in office since 2017. Before getting into politics, she was involved in activism.
I saw an interview with Greta Thunberg where she said she was watching what was going on, and she said, it's just, and I'm paraphrasing, she said, it's so absurd. Someone has to do something. And she goes, and then I realized I'm a someone.
Yeah.
Sometimes leadership calls on people. I want to ask you about your journey to the role that you're in today. Was it something like that where you're like, I need to go out and lead? Or when does someone wake up and say, you know, I need to be the prime minister and I need to lead this country in a direction? How do you get to where you're sitting across from me talking today?
Well, it wasn't because I woke up and said I need to be a prime minister, you know, it's not that. I'm a person who really, I have a political vision for the future. But when it comes to me personally, I simply live, you know, one day at a time. And sometimes when I'm asked, you know, how did you become a prime minister? The simple answer is really because I tend to say yes when people ask me to do something. And that often puts me in a lot of trouble. But this is just a tendency I have. I tend to say yes.
We're seeing a lot more women in Iceland saying yes. This election was pretty dramatic in that regard. I want to get your thoughts on that. Almost a majority of women in parliament.
Yeah, and you know, very exciting developments during election night. You know, at one point there was a majority, but we have a very high rate of women, and we have seen women really stepping up on the political, in the political field, really here in Iceland. So, and it's part of the privilege of living here, where we actually have a very strong women's movement, which actually has made such a huge difference. You know, I wouldn't be prime minister if there hadn't been that women's movement in the 60s and the 70s who fought for, you know, kindergartens for every children, so actually the mothers could go out and work. I probably wouldn't be here either if there hadn't been women fighting for a shared parental leave. So actually men and women take equal part when the babies are born, and they take equal part in their upbringing. So I say, you know, the reason I'm here is not because I'm great. The reason I'm here is that we have a lot of women who actually fought for a change in the system.
Interesting. I saw someone talking about how you took advantage of the leave, and that some said it's going to ruin her political career. It certainly hasn't. And men are taking full advantage here in Iceland as well.
Yeah, well, I'm one of the few ministers who have actually gone on a parental leave, you know, just got pregnant and took a leave. And then, as you say, a lot of people said, she's obviously leaving politics. But that's so absurd. You know, why shouldn't politicians be able to have children and actually fulfill their obligations towards those children and then come back? You shouldn't have to make a choice between having a career in politics and having children. Men don't have to make those choices. So women shouldn't have to make those choices either. It should just be part of a normal life.
Speaking of children, if I've got it right, 3 sons?
Yes.
I suspect they're probably too young to vote.
Sadly.
Yes.
Yes.
They would vote for you, obviously.
I hope so. I'm not sure.
But
I have raised them to be pretty independent in thinking, so you never know what's going to happen.
You even have to fight to get their votes. But you're the prime minister for them as well. I mean, because your vision is futuristic when you talk about climate change. It's present, but it's also the future. It's their future. Yeah. As a mother, how does that weigh on you?
I think it's very important for us who are in politics to think about the interests of future generations, to think about the balance of us who are living now and those who are, you know, growing up in our world. An Icelandic author wrote a very interesting book, actually, on climate change, where he made that connection saying the world your grandparents were born into and grew up in, and the world that your grandchildren are going to be born into and grow up in, what is the difference of those worlds? And how are we going to ensure that that difference won't be devastating? Because it's such a short time span, really, that it kind of, just when I'm saying this, I get, I feel a little bit chilly because of the huge changes that have happened since my grandparents were born and grew up. And then I think about the children my boys are going to have. And what conditions are they going to grow up in? So it's a huge responsibility for us right now.
With multiple political parties involved, Katrin's coalition government is taking a groundbreaking approach addressing a variety of issues, from how to handle COVID to the impacts of climate change.
When you look at this country, this coalition, and you look in the United States, you can't get either party to cooperate with one another.
Yeah.
What's the answer there?
I think actually the reason for this coalition is actually the fact that we wanted to somehow fight the increased polarization in political debates. And it is difficult because it is difficult to cooperate with people you really don't agree with on some issues. But then you just have to kind of find new solutions through the dialogue. And that's why I'm a great believer in dialogue. I'm a great believer in dialogue in Icelandic politics, but also in international politics, because I really believe that understanding the people who disagree with you is a very important step to find good solutions for every society. And you don't have to agree all the time. You just have to be ready to understand the other party.
But COVID and climate have something in common, which I think is also an obstacle, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this. And that, COVID, I remember talking to a neighbor about, oh, geez, I know 5 or 6 people that have gotten it. She hadn't met anybody. She didn't think it was a thing, and climate change isn't something that you can see, like staring. It's there, obviously you can see it, but for most people it's like, oh, it's a thing, and COVID, it's a thing, unless you know somebody who's been affected by it. So trying to get people to think about it, that's tough, isn't it?
Yeah, and maybe, because when you make opinion polls in Iceland, Iceland has really prioritized this issue. And I think that's because they actually see it happen. And it's a little bit different when you're actually not, when in your daily life, you're just going to your work and back and not seeing those effects really up close and personal, So I think that's definitely an issue, and it's difficult because in COVID it was more like an urgency happening now. This is happening here and now. When it comes to climate, we've been faced also with the challenge that people say, well, it's going to be tomorrow, right? But not today. And that's challenging, and it's also challenging to give people some hope. Because I also get that people say, okay, this is so big and so difficult that you really can't do anything about it. And that is maybe the biggest challenge of it all, really, to say, yes, we can. If the government leads the way, if the companies join forces with us, if the public comes with us, we can actually make a difference. And even though we're small, because that's one of the questions I get asked here in Iceland, we're so small. What difference do we make? This is, the United States and China and Russia and India. They are those who should be doing something. But then I say, we can actually make our voice heard, tell people what's happening here in Iceland, what we see is happening to our glaciers and our oceans. And we can also say, but we actually did this. So it is possible to make that change.
It's interesting, I think it was just a few weeks ago, you were at this new carbon capture plant.
Yes.
To me, it's so interesting, all the innovations going on in Iceland. But you talked about government, you talked about business. We're going to a town in the north where it's pretty much carbon neutral, where the people themselves are rallying around. So it can be done on so many different levels, right? And it needs to, right?
It needs to. But I'm always very clear to say, you can't put the responsibility on the individual only. because sometimes, being an activist, I used to be an activist, and you do a lot of things. You cycle to work, or you switch over to an electric car, and you try to reuse and recycle. But I always say the governments must lead the way, and we must make the rest of society join forces with us. And you can't just put the responsible on the individual. But when government is leading, it's easier for the individual to make the good choices for the environment.
Although Iceland may be small with just over 360,000 people, its ideas are catching the attention of international policymakers. The Nordic island nation has considerable ties with both the United States and China.
We're going tomorrow to the China-Iceland Arctic Observatory, which shows a close cooperation between China and Iceland, and the geopolitical pressures of being a country where you want to have good relations with the United States and also China and everyone else. How difficult is it to navigate all of that?
Well, I think because you mentioned that, when it comes to academic cooperation, like this particular project is really an academic cooperation. Iceland actually has a very widespread cooperation around the world with a lot of different countries. So I think cooperation when it comes to research and also in culture actually can prove to be a very valuable ground for dialogue in other areas. So, but obviously it's a difficult, it's a challenging, let's say that, it's a challenging environment because we sense a lot of interest, geopolitical interest in the Arctic. And there we are very determined to say the Arctic should stay a low tension area, an area where everybody can actually have that dialogue, because the interests are not just economical and the interests are not just concerning security. The biggest interests in the Arctic is actually the climate and the ecology.
You talked about the Arctic Council and the vision for the next 10 years. Talk to me about that vision and your vision for Iceland when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, well, actually our focus in the Arctic Council was on climate. And what we see actually here is that the climate change is happening at a double pace. It's happening faster than other places in the world, even though it's a global issue. So you could say that the Arctic is really saying, the message of the Arctic is very clear, that we need to act. So this has been our main issue, but also the rights of the people who live in the Arctic, who sometimes, because of that geopolitical interest, tend to be forgotten. And it's very important to remember that there are people living there and they also need to have opportunities to make their own communities and follow their dreams in our world. And then we have actually put specific focus on gender equality, which is always part of our foreign policy wherever we come, which was considered, I think, interesting in the Arctic, interesting subject really in the Arctic Council, which maybe hasn't been really focused on those issues, but they also matter greatly because you have different decisions made about the Arctic when you have both men and women sitting around the table. And I think when you talk about the vision for Iceland when it comes to the climate crisis, we have actually made an action plan how we can achieve our goals, but we are actually also revising that now because of the new IPCC report, how we can become more ambitious. And even though we have a very, over 80% of our energy comes from renewables, but we still can make an effort and we can actually make concrete and realistic plans on reduction.
Listen, babe, you the sweetest chick in the whole market.
It's not often that I interview a leader of a country that's also been in a music video. Can you tell us how that came about?
Well, as I said earlier, I tend to say yes. And I said yes to become a prime minister. I said yes to play, act in a music video. Because, I haven't had an ambition to be a politician all my life. I have done a lot of things. And I enjoy doing a lot of things. And I'm not going to be a politician all my life. I still have a lot of things to say yes to.
Well, we're happy you said yes to our invitation to sit down with us. We certainly appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.